Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Now, you're under the quilt. The air smells faintly of beeswax and old libraries, and we're about to tiptoe through the oddest corners of Victorian beauty. Yes, the era where a nice corset could hug your waist into next Wednesday. Arsenic was somehow your BFF, and nothing said, "I'm feeling flirty," quite like whale fat on your eyebrows. Let's begin with faces, not ours, theirs. Victorian women were obsessed with porcelain skin, pale, glowing, and wholly untroubled by the ravages of actual nature. Tans implied outdoor labour, which was far too peasanty for a respectable lady. To achieve that luminous moonbeam pallor, many women turned to a little assistance. Lead was fashionable, as in actually painting one's face with lead-based powders. Experts today might call that a poor life decision, but back then it was cutting-edge radiance. Now, lead, bless it, has the aggravating tendency to slowly poison the wearer. Over time, skin would crack, teeth would fall out, and personalities would shift from "I say, good sir" to "Why is Lady Margaret trying to marry the fireplace?" But at least she looked stunning, like a haunted porcelain doll who just remembered the Crimean War. And if lead didn't tickle your fancy, there was always a good dose of arsenic. Arsenic wafers, real store-bought arsenic, promised to whiten the skin to a pious glow. "Eat and ye shall shine," the label may as well have read. Doctors tried to protest, but the fashion pages won. Even Queen Victoria's personal physician once said, "The arsenic craze is getting out of, well, hand." This pursuit of paleness came with other charming additions. Freckles, for instance, nature's whimsical polka dots, were the enemy. Victorian ladies would dab lemon juice on their faces each morning, not because they fancied a salad, but because they hoped the acid would bleach away the sun's unforgivable doodles. There were also special potions, like the delightfully named milk of roses, which, contrary to its name, could smell like anything from wilted bouquet water to the back alley of a goat. But marketed properly, it was a must-have skincare miracle in a world that pitied the undertanned. But perhaps you're wondering, what about makeup? Surely they wore rouge. Yes and no. The painted lady was a complicated idea. Nice girls avoided obvious cosmetics, lest they be mistaken for, say, a woman of looser corsets. So subtlety was the name of the game. A pinched cheek here, a gentle lip biting before tea. Yes, you were essentially self-assaulting your face into looking lively. Still, powders and tints did exist. Most were mixed at home, using ingredients like crushed beetles, burnt, cork, and a little vinegar for that je ne sais chemical burn. And if a lady had the misfortune of overdoing it, she'd quickly find herself called fast, which, in Victorian slang, didn't mean quick on her feet. It meant headed straight for scandal and probably arrested by Thursday. Hair, too, had its secrets. To achieve that majestic, upswept look, you needed volume. However, shampooing was done rarely, perhaps once a month, if you were feeling reckless. So women collected their fallen hair from brushes, dressing tables, suspicious combs, and stuffed it into something called a rat. Yes, really, a hair rat. Not an actual rat, although one suspects some lazy hairdressers didn't check. These hair rats were bundled into buns or pompadours to puff up a style. There was truly no dignity spared in the service of volume. A woman could walk past you with 5 years' worth of fallen hair perched atop her scalp and not even blink. Although, to be fair, heavy pins made blinking optional. We'll close here, dear listener, before the cat hops onto your belly and demands dream tax. But think of those parlour rooms and flickers of gaslight, the whispered giggles as arsenic was passed with the crumpets, and the pride of knowing your natural beauty required a home chemistry set and a minor miracle. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. By the flickering oil-lit glow of a Victorian dressing table, where lace doilies knew no rest and porcelain dolls watched everything with suspiciously accusatory glances, our journey tiptoes into the world of skincare, or, as the Victorians called it, slightly less dying-looking face management. The 19th century, you see, was positively obsessed with appearing delicate. A perfect complexion was practically a moral achievement. Your skin wasn't just skin, it was a statement. And ideally, it was the colour of alabaster that had accidentally gotten a bit sad. Modern terms would call it extremely pale. Victorian standards would call it one breeze away from ghost. To maintain this ghastly chic, Victorian women didn't merely avoid the sun. No, that would have been ordinary. What they did was cultivate the pallor of someone who just emerged from a fainting couch. The secret: a powdery potion delightfully laced with arsenic. Yes, arsenic. As in, the poison featured prominently in every respectable murder mystery of the time. Arsenic wafers were sold over the counter for exactly this purpose: to ingest and slowly bleach oneself from the inside out. Not enough to kill, of course. A lady's goal was softly luminous death adjacency. Think glow of a haunted chandelier. Now, you may reasonably ask, wouldn't this be dangerous? Absolutely. But in an era when corsetry rearranged your ribs and everyone was gently simmering in layers of wool, a little thing like arsenic was simply a spirited commitment to beauty. It didn't stop there. The pearls of the Victorian bathroom cabinet shone with other creative concoctions. For the especially daring debutante, there was lead-based face cream, smooth, ivory-like, and only moderately neurotoxic. Not to be confused with your average pot of moisturizer. No. This was artisanally crafted in places like France and proudly laced with white lead to give your skin that "I just saw a ghost and honestly envy her radiance" glow. But what if you couldn't afford the finest French poisons? Fear not, the economy had options. Some women, ever the DIY pioneers, made their own skin-lightening potions at home. Recipes varied, but a trusted favourite included vinegar, lemon juice, chalk, and a hint of burnt almonds for a fragrant touch of "am I dying" or just fashionable. There was, famously, one countess of a minor but flamboyantly named county who swore by nightly applications of raw veal. Yes, meat, pressed to the cheeks, wrapped in muslin, for hours. The theory being that the vitality of young calf would whisper its youth into your pores. The reality being you definitely smelled like dinner. But vanity has always been a little carnivorous. Eyebrows, meanwhile, were a delicate matter. The less seen, the better. In fact, many women shaved them clean off, lest those insolent facial caterpillars suggest emotion or, heaven forbid, agency. In their place, a soft shadow was sometimes penciled in with lampblack, a soot harvested from oil lamps, because nothing says dainty like smearing a bit of chimney across your face. And in the cloistered quiet of night, after the maids had scuttled away and the gas lights dimmed low, these same women would sleep not on standard cotton pillows, but upon wax-coated headrests designed to keep their meticulously pale faces untouched. Pillowcases were for amateurs and red-cheeked peasants. The truly elegant took their rest hovering just above comfort. At the heart of it all wasn't just absurdity. It was earnest aspiration. The pursuit of beauty, by Victorian standards, was a delicate negotiation with danger. Every pallid cheek, every softly veiled sniffle whispered, "I am so fragile. I probably faint at compliments. Please marry me before I disappear into a lace shawl." Our next delight takes us beneath the bonnet, into the mysterious domain of Victorian hair care, where eggs, brandy, and the occasional baked potato all vied for a spot on the scalp. Prepare your dreams. Things are about to get delightfully scrambled. In the joyful madness of Victorian beauty, there existed a time when eyebrows were not merely shaped, they were mourned. Yes, mourned. Like a pet parrot or a favourite pair of gloves misplaced during a foggy stroll through Hyde Park. Because in the mid-1800s, the ultimate sign of feminine delicacy, real, true, soup-has-cooled elegance, was no eyebrows at all. You see, having thick, lustrous brows was akin to shouting in public or eating a meat pie with your hands, positively vulgar. Instead, the fashionable lady of leisure often tweezed her brows into oblivion, leaving only the quiet memory of them behind, as if they had been lost to a tragic poetic accident at sea. But removal was only the beginning. For those born with scandalously visible brows, further measures were taken. Enter belladonna, an extract from deadly nightshade, the Victorian equivalent of asking a poisonous plant to help you look more mysterious. Now, belladonna was primarily used to dilate pupils, giving women wide, glistening, "I just saw a ghost" eyes. But it frequently wore a double costume, appearing as eye drops and a dab of forehead and brow application, gently discouraging hair growth over time. It worked approximately as well as whispering at your eyebrows to go away, but with more peril. And speaking of peril, arsenic. Yes, good old arsenic. That helpful household item used for exterminating rats, murdering fictional uncles, and of course, perfecting one's complexion. There were powders and wafers on the market. Real-life advertisements proclaimed the virtues of Dr. Rose's arsenic complexion wafers, as though arsenic was simply a misunderstood vitamin. The packaging promised whiter skin, a porcelain glow, and fewer blemishes. What it did not promise, but often delivered, was severe digestive upset, organ failure, and a level of pallor ordinarily reserved for operatic ghosts. Still, to the blushing Victorian belle, what was a little internal bleeding if it made you look like a statue of Aphrodite carved in cold marble? A good many women approached beauty as if it were warfare, and their weapons were formidable: corsets that could rupture ribs, paints that peeled skin, and the occasional boiled lead facial. That's right, lead. There was a particularly fashionable white paste called Venetian ceruse, a mix of vinegar and helpfully lead, which had been around for centuries but still held its ghastly grip on the beauty world. Roman women used it, Elizabethan ladies swore by it, and Victorian women, nestled between revolutions and inventions, simply carried on the tradition, applying a cool, ghostly layer to their cheeks and foreheads. It gave the impression that one rarely left the house, or perhaps hadn't blinked in several hours. The goal, after all, was not merely to look pretty. It was to resemble a fragile female in distress, Tim, someone too delicate to fetch her own shawl, let alone participate in a full-colour reality. Sometimes they even added a splash of rouge to cheeks or lips, not too much, lest they flirt too hard with mortality's cousin, theatricality. But let's not forget the hair. Hair in all its complicated, gravity-defying glory. The Victorian fashion for elaborate hairstyles required not merely patience, but also scaffolding, quite literally. Wire frames and false hairpieces were tucked, pinned, and built upon to create towers of ringlets, braids, and buns, so dramatically piled they threatened to eclipse nearby furniture. To keep these elegant nests in place, women turned to an unlikely ally: beef fat, more precisely, bear's grease, a rendered animal fat touted for its ability to stimulate hair growth and hold styles in place. It was famously pungent, like a Victorian picnic conducted inside a butcher's shop, but apparently effective, or at least very enthusiastic about its job. And so, by layering lead paste, trimming away brows, scenting their hair with beef, and voting yes to small doses of arsenic, Victorian women reached heights and smells rarely rivaled in history, all in service to a beauty standard that whispered, "If you look healthy, you're doing it wrong." Of course, beauty ideals aren't entirely rational endeavors. They're part fashion, part fear, part dream. And in the gaslit parlors and velvet-draped bedrooms of the 19th century, perfection lay somewhere between the pharmacy and the physician's warning label. Now, if you're feeling cozy, and just a touch thankful you don't own bear grease, we can drift onward to the curious world of Victorian eyes, where danger came not from squinting too hard, but from seeing too much. Soft candlelight flickers on the velvet-draped vanity. A faint smell of lavender and just the barest whiff of burned feathers lingers in the air. Don't worry, that's not your imagination. It's Victorian England, and someone is trying to curl their eyelashes using a device that looks more like a toaster than a beauty tool. You see, in the strangely resourceful world of the 19th century, eyelashes were not yet the fluttering battleground we know today, but the Victorians were warming up to the idea. Literally. Enter the heated eyelash curler. Now try to picture a curling iron, but tinier. Then, take away all modern safety standards. Add a pair of leather gloves and a prayer. These lash curlers were briefly dipped into a flame, tested cautiously against the back of one's hand, or not, depending on one's tolerance for misadventure, and then brought terrifyingly close to the eye, all to produce a coquettish bend in the lashes. The risk? Slightly singed lashes at best. At worst, a look that suggested you just dueled with a dragon and lost. But you mustn't assume they were reckless. No, the Victorians were passionately inventive. They lived in a time where electricity was only beginning to illuminate homes. So naturally, the idea of heat styling had to be handled with the tools of a fireplace. And honestly, who among us hasn't questioned fashion-related decisions? If lashes weren't long enough, there was the option of enhancement. Artificial eyelashes, though modern sounding, have roots we can trace to the rather unsettling beauty parlors of the 1890s, where you could have real human hair painstakingly sewn into your eyelids with a needle and thread. Yes, sewn. The procedure was described in newspapers of the time as eminently desirable and only mildly uncomfortable, which is Victorian slang for should probably come with a complimentary glass of laudanum. It wasn't just lashes that got attention. Brows, those expressive arcs of facial punctuation, were treated with similar reverence. A proper Edwardian brow was soft, feminine, and almost apologetically understated. Nothing like the fierce, caterpillar-like confidence of the 2020s. To achieve this gentle look, women would often bleach their brows with mercuric concoctions or lemon juice left overnight. The results ranged from delicately pale to, "Did you have eyebrows this morning?" And in rare but delightful cases, Some women borrowed from their dressing table neighbour the moustache cream to remove errant brow hairs. Victorian vanity truly had no boundaries. If it could remove hair, whiten skin, or thicken lashes, it would be used, even if it was originally intended for Uncle Harold's upper lip. And speaking of lashes and brows, one mustn't forget Vaseline, the Victorian queen of everything. It wasn't just for chapped lips and sore hands. It was the multitasking miracle sludge of the century, applied nightly to lashes, brows, cheekbones, and split ends. Vaseline was thought to promote growth, sheen, and that ever-elusive glow mentioned in so many beauty guides of the time. Did it work? Hard to say. Most women probably just woke up looking like disappointed hedgehogs, but they believed, and that, in the world of beauty rituals, always counts for something. But let's not get too judgy. Their intentions were, dare I say, earnest. Victorian beauty was about appearing effortlessly lovely, delicately manicured, and only moderately irradiated or flammable. Because the greatest compliment a lady could receive in those soft-lit parlours was to be described as having a natural glow, which, sometimes, was actual glowing, thanks to radioactive face creams, but we'll get to that later. For now, with your lashes fully extended in your imagination, and thankfully unsinged, allow your thoughts to drift deeper, past the flickering gaslight and into a quieter corner of Victorian beauty, where faint whispers speak of complexions so pale, they bordered on the ghostly, and powders were more dangerous than they were decorative. But that, dear dreamer, is a secret we'll gently uncover next. On a moon-drenched evening in Victorian England, somewhere between the rustling of crinoline and the soft sigh of a candle flame, a rather curious practice unfurled its silky wings across dressing tables of the fashionable set. Imagine, if you will, a well-to-do lady perched before her mirror, her skin powdered porcelain pale, her silhouette corseted like a wasted teacup. But instead of reaching for rouge or mascara, two words which I assure you were uttered only behind closed doors. She dips a tiny brush into something most unexpected, belladonna, literally meaning beautiful woman. And because the Victorians loved a name that whispered romance while screaming danger, it was the ideal elixir for the eyes. You see, the dilated pupil was at one time a hallmark of feminine allure. A glance, wide and starry, conveyed rapture or mystery, or simply the promise of swooning at poetry. So they turned to belladonna eye drops, derived from deadly nightshade, yes, the poison, for that coveted glassy-eyed look. A single drop, and your pupils would increase in size, the world becoming hazy, and your own reflection just a little more glamorous, and a lot more hallucinatory. It wasn't terribly practical, mind you, or safe. Dilated pupils let in more light, yes, but also made everything a bit too bright, rather like walking into a ballroom lit entirely with gas lamps and ambition. Prolonged use could cause blurred vision, heart palpitations, and, in some troubling cases, permanent eye damage. But to Victorian society, poor health was practically an accessory, right in vogue with consumptive cheekbones and a cough, like crushed violets. The idea of enhancing one's eyes, not just with a flirt of a fan or a 6-syllable sonnet, but with chemical warfare, fit quite neatly into the era's aesthetic neuroses. To look ephemeral, a bit undone, as if you might faint at the sight of a moonbeam? Well, one couldn't simply be delicate. One had to engineer it. Much of this ingenuity took place without the benefit of science as we now know it. The medical journal was not yet a glittering companion to the makeup case. Instead, women leaned toward old wives' tales, cosmetic recipes found in the margins of family cookbooks, and gossip from bathhouses attended by the gentry and those pretending to be. After all, this wasn't the only optical oddity to cross the Victorian vanity. Some women, in pursuit of the era's glamour, reportedly rimmed their eyes with burnt matchsticks or lamp black, a gooey residue that looked and smelled precisely as romantic as it sounds. Others lined their lids with crushed elderberries or powdered charcoal, often stored in little tins disguised as respectable pillboxes. One woman's berry stain was another's medicinal tonic, and who's to say which was which when the labels were smudged and enchantingly vague? Even eyelashes, those fluttery fans of flirtation, weren't safe from invention. A few brave souls are believed to have experimented with lightly singeing lashes to curl them upwards. Fascinatingly horrifying. Nothing says devotion to beauty like allowing a friend to bring flame dangerously close to your iris. Men, meanwhile, were not entirely immune to ocular exaggeration. Though less inclined to poison themselves into enchantment, they admired the effect all the same, and sometimes sought their own bright eyes through a finely tuned diet of liver, oysters, and mysterious patent tonics promising clarity, vigor, and utterly unrelated sideburn enhancement. It's comforting, or alarming, to recognize that even well before TikTok, humanity was willing to risk a vital organ or two for the illusion of glamour. That romance, as it turns out, often came bottled beside regret, by the light of oil lamps as novels were read aloud and teaspoons clinked musically against porcelain saucers. Visions blurred not just from dilated pupils, but from the dreamy dizziness of societal beauty rules. The line between allure and absurdity was not just thin, it was winged with eyeliner. And so, we leave our belladonna-eyed belle blinking gently into her lace-draped mirror, her gaze dreamy, mysterious, and possibly not seeing a thing. What marvels await her next on the journey toward the perfect Victorian visage? The night deepens, the air turns velvet thick, and the next beauty mystery drifts just beyond the powder room doors, exhaling a faint trace of rosewater and arsenic. Let's drift now, ever so drowsily, into the softly candlelit parlours of the 1850s, where lace draped in corners like sleeping cobwebs, and ladies perfected the art of sitting very still, while someone else poked them in the face with a tiny metal stick. Yes, dear dreamer, it's time we tiptoe into the curious Victorian world of eyebrow tattoos, though perhaps tattoos is a generous term. You might imagine something permanent, artistic, slightly rebellious. But the Victorians were a different breed. They sought to enhance nature while pretending to ignore it entirely, like writing love poetry to eyebrows, but signing it anonymous. In this quest for the perfectly arched brow, some women turn to a method known as needle painting. If this sounds like a nightmare version of embroidery, that's because it absolutely was. A fine steel needle would be dipped into a mix of ink, often homemade, sometimes with elderberry juice or soot, and then tapped gently, tapped into the upper layers of the skin. The goal, to subtly darken the pale and whisper-soft brows of high society ladies who, thanks to dim lighting and anemia, were in constant danger of disappearing entirely from the face. Of course, this beauty craft was not practiced openly. Oh no, eyebrow enhancement was something one did in strict privacy, as if mortifying one's forehead was akin to committing tax fraud. A lady might quietly train her maid to perform the procedure by lamplight late at night, with silence as thick as her new brows would hopefully become. There was no aftercare to speak of, just a vague hope that no one would ask why her eyebrows looked angrier than usual at Wednesday's tea. Now, naturally, this all sounds questionable. One might wonder why the Victorian lady didn't simply use, say, a nice pencil. But 15 years before Crayola gave us crayons, eyebrow pencils weren't exactly lining drugstore shelves. Instead, women reached for burnt almonds. Yes, almonds. Plucked discreetly from the punch bowl, toasted over a candle, and then rubbed gently over the brow ridge. Imagine the scene: elegant ball gown, opera gloves, and a light snack smouldering over an open flame, all in the name of glamour. Of course, the danger of applying fire-charred nuts near one's eye raised more than a few safety eyebrows. But fashion, like ambition, has always required a little recklessness, and perhaps they figured the smoky undertones only added mystery to one's overall look. After all, if your eyebrows smell faintly of dessert, who's to question it? For those with more adventurous spirits, and perhaps fewer nerve endings, there were also recipes for eyebrow dyes involving walnut bark, vinegar, and sometimes even ferrous sulfate, which one charming 1862 manual referred to as the gentleman's choice for a brow both stately and severe. Naturally, it could also cause light skin blistering if used in sunlight. But what's a little blistering if one's eyebrows announce strength, prestige, and potentially mild chemical burns? And for the gentlemen, well, they were not immune to the eyebrow game. Victorian men, especially those receding at the forehead, often relied on the same magic in reverse. Some even used tiny brushes to fill in thinning arches with India ink or mustache wax, artfully repurposed, as if one could borrow a little dignity from the lip and sweep it thoughtfully onto the brow. Some drank potions claiming to restore brow growth, though these often contained more excitement than science, such as borax, brandy, and the root of something unspeakable. Still, in all this brow-enhancing frenzy, one truth endured. Beauty, like a good corset, was about illusion. The fuller brow didn't always mean the fuller brain, but it certainly helped your odds at a better dance card. And while no one spoke openly of eyebrow poking, everyone noticed when Lady Marchington's thin comma brows turned lush overnight. They whispered, they wondered, and perhaps the next night, they lit their tiny lamp and tapped. Let's leave the parlor now, whispers trailing behind us like a well-placed veil. For there are more secrets waiting behind the powder pots, within the pores, and under just enough blush to imply health without the indignity of exercise. Let us drift now into the orange glow candlelit corridors of 19th century drawing rooms, where ladies lounged like fainting was a full-time job, and being beautiful wasn't so much a natural glow as it was a full-on chemically enhanced lifestyle choice. And nowhere was this more disarmingly evident than in their subtle, well, not so subtle use of poisons for glamour's sake. Ah, poison. It's not just for political assassinations and Shakespearean plot twists anymore. No, in the late Victorian era, it was positively en vogue to doll oneself up with the very substances that medical almanacs warned should never come within an arm's distance of your bloodstream. Take, for example, belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade. But that's just goth marketing. Women didn't just grow it in their gardens for stylish backyard poisoning parties, although who knows? No, they dropped it into their eyes. Yes, into their actual eyeballs. Why? Because belladonna dilated the pupils, making them appear wide, dark, and brimming with less suspicion and more seductive mystery. That soft, doe-eyed look wasn't just from batting lashes at suitors, it was pharmacologically induced. The name itself, belladonna, means beautiful woman. because apparently nothing flatters like inflamed optic nerves. Of course, nature likes balance. For every flirty blink came a side dish of blurred vision, an increased heart rate, and a casual risk of blindness. But fear not. Victorians were nothing if not prepared to die a little for aesthetics. After all, what's a bit of irreversible eye damage compared to the promise of a better marriage offer? And they didn't stop at the eyes. The skin, too, had to reflect a consumptive fragility, a sort of swoon-ready pallor. Tans were for orchard hands and field workers. Sun exposure was the aesthetic equivalent of forgetting your corset at a royal picnic. The elite, therefore, turned to powders laced with lead and arsenic. Yes, lead. Yes, arsenic. No, not on accident. These powders belied the harsh truth of Victorian cosmetics. If it didn't slowly erode your organs or shatter your bone marrow over a polite 5-year span, was it even worth wearing? A complexion tinged in porcelain death was the season's ultimate statement piece. It said, "I'm delicate," with a whisper of, "and my cheekbones are being corroded internally." For those with a little more time and a touch more daring, there were arsenic wafers, dainty little toxic tablets that women dissolved under their tongues to improve their skin tone. According to dubious ads and mysteriously enthusiastic testimonials, ingestion of these deliciously dangerous morsels would smooth the skin, lighten the eyes, and rob the cheeks of any vulgar trace of blood flow. Apparently, surviving the dosage was just a bonus. Now, if you're thinking, surely the men were smarter, I must gently correct you. They were not. Victorian men, too, tangled with toxins in their pursuit of dashing, gentlemanly appearances. Many applied lead-based hair tonics to maintain that brooding raven black shine. These tonics worked admirably, turning grey hair dark and often turning the scalp slightly numb, presumably for variety. In some more desperate corners of fashion, gentlemen would daub their moustaches with waxes that doubled as fire hazards, particularly in parlours with vigorous pipe smoking. Of course, nothing screamed upstanding citizen like a pair of trembling hands and a persistent metallic aftertaste. The real marvel here, besides the fact that the entire aristocracy wasn't wiped out by its lipstick, is just how much faith Victorians placed in pseudoscientific beauty marketing. With dermatology still a glint in medical science's eye, beauty advice came not from pharmacists, but from gossip, the occasional newspaper column, and a disturbing amount of trial and error. Mostly error. In fairness, we can't entirely blame them. This was the age when electricity was magic. Queen Victoria herself was an influencer of morning attire, and if your face itched after your nightly powder, the logical solution was usually apply more powder. Like antique snowflakes, each powdered, pupil-dilated peeress drifted delicately through society ballrooms, hopefully not too close to the candelabras, lest their arsenic perfume combust. And the end goal was always the same: to look too fragile to do something monstrous, like, say, digest a radish. But don't worry, we've only just tiptoed into the delightfully dangerous cabinet of Victorian cosmetics. As you settle deeper into your pillow, we'll soon unfurl another ingredient from the age of questionable potions and even more questionable advice, because nothing says beauty like slathering your face in something your chemist won't touch without gloves. There was perhaps no clearer sign that the Victorian era had ambitions than when it turned its curious little eyes upon the noble eyebrow. Yes, the eyebrow, that marvellous pair of facial punctuation marks perched above the windows of the soul. Today, we pluck, primp, and tint with enthusiasm, but the Victorians, They had their own ideas. Ideas involving mouse fur, real mouse fur. You see, in an age when morality was measured in millimeters of modesty and every gesture was judged with the weight of a social sermon, eyebrows could not merely exist. They had to whisper elegance. Bold, dark brows were considered striking, but tragically, they weren't always provided by nature, especially in an era where malnourishment was practically a lifestyle brand and stress was just called Tuesday. So what did a lady of refinement do when her natural brows were barely more than dreamy vapors, barely clinging to her forehead in the harsh London fog? Why, naturally, she turned to mice. Yes, as in the small, squeaky varieties scuttling under floorboards. Those tiny pillows of fur became unwitting donors to Victorian fashion, especially when one's eyebrows needed a bit of density. The process, in case your imagination isn't already galloping away in horror, went roughly like this. Harvest the fur from a recently expired mouse. Never worry about the method. Let's just assume the mouse politely volunteered in the name of fashion. Craft 2 perfect arcs out of his former coat and affix them delicately above the eyes using a trusty blob of spirit gum. Spirit gum, for the unfamiliar and uninitiated, is essentially the Victorian answer to glue. It's been used for centuries by actors and magicians to affix false moustaches, sideburns, and now, apparently, deceased rodent fur to foreheads. Bear in mind, this was not a lowbrow endeavor. Oh no, this was society at its most elegant. There are even whispered references in some periodicals of the time referring to French eyebrows, which I assure you does not translate to a Parisian technique, but rather this very rodential procedure. Nothing says ooh la la like a mouse curling up for a nap above your orbital bone. The trend, as with most strange things, caught on among the tragically fashionable. Eyebrows made of mouse fur offered a reliable boldness, and they didn't rub off under stress like charcoaled brows might, unless, of course, you forgot to affix them properly, in which case there were reports of pets suddenly developing very distinguished facial features after a cuddle. One can only imagine Aunt Mildred's horror upon discovering her Persian cat had waddled off with her left eyebrow. Now, the truly inventive women of the era might even keep several sets of mouse fur brows on hand, one for daywear, one for visiting the vicar, a third set, dramatically arched, for evenings involving candlelight, port wine, or scandal. Of course, not everyone approved. There were clergymen with thunderous sermons on the dangers of false adornments, and a few lonely doctors who worried gently that gluing small animal parts to one's skin might be unhealthy. But fashion, as ever, feared neither logic nor hygiene. The best part, there was an etiquette. For instance, it was considered dreadfully informal for one's mouse brows to be too symmetrical. One needed just enough asymmetry to suggest effortless charm. Too perfect, you looked stern. Too askew, and you looked like you just had a surprise sneeze. Now, you may be wondering, did the gentlemen participate in this trend? Not quite. While the chaps of the Victorian age had their own eccentricities, more on those in due time, falsified mouse eyebrows somehow never made it into male fashion, despite their enthusiasm for false moustaches. A rare case of restraint. All in all, it's just further proof that when it came to beauty, the Victorians could summon a level of commitment that waltzed right past practicality and strolled confidently into performance art. So next time you furrow your brow in confusion or raise it in mild judgment, spare a sweet thought for the mouse, forgotten by history, but once a staple of upper-class glamour. And speaking of upper-class glamour, What would one wear to complement a pair of fur-enhanced brows, you ask? Ah, that calls for a word on arsenic dresses, but we'll examine that hypnotic horror next, should you still be awake. While modern skincare might have you slathering your face in snail slime, caffeine serums, or something optimistically called cloud cream, the Victorians were inventing their own strange methods of complexion control, often with ingredients better suited to your local tool shed than your bathroom shelf. Picture, if you will, the soft flicker of gaslight on an alabaster face, an idealized image of womanly beauty painted with the quiet desperation of someone who just rubbed ammonia on her cheeks to give them that rosy glow. Yes, that's right. Ammonia. The kind you may have used to scrub your kitchen tiles. Victorian women, in their eternal quest for a healthy flush, would sometimes dabble in household cleaning products. Because why not? Apparently, when blush wasn't handy or was too scandalous to use, heady fumes and mild chemical burns could do the job just as well. Great beauty, as any sleep-deprived chimney sweep might tell you, requires great sacrifice. Of course, the paleness was even more prized than the flush. Pale skin meant you were refined. It told the world, no thank you. I haven't been outside working under the sun. I've been inside, doing ladylike things, like needlepoint and fainting. And so began the era of lead-based face creams. A dab here, a smear there, and voila. You too could have a ghostly countenance worthy of a Bronte novel. Granted, over time, your gums might turn blue and your teeth might fall out. But think of the glow. Lead wasn't the only toxic treasure in the vanity arsenal. Arsenic made a frequent appearance as well. Beloved in everything from skincare to wafers designed to be nibbled politely while slowly poisoning oneself to that perfect milky white glow. Victorian beauty companies actually sold arsenic complexion wafers, tiny paper-thin discs of doom that promised to fade freckles and banish blemishes. In the short term, perhaps they succeeded. In the long term, well, let's just say the Victorians had strange ideas about what constituted inner radiance. And then there was belladonna, a substance derived from the deadly nightshade plant. Don't be alarmed by the deadly part. That only slightly enhances the drama. Ladies used drops of it in their eyes to dilate the pupils, creating that wide-eyed, dreamy look that screamed innocence, mystery, and probable visual impairment. While it was effective for achieving that I've just seen a vision aesthetic, side effects included dry eyes, blurred vision, and eventually blindness. But beauty, darling, never sleeps, except when it's resting its over-dilated eyeballs under an embroidered velvet eye mask. Not to be outdone by substances that could slowly unalive you, some beauty seekers went the mechanical route. One charming invention was the facial corset, a kind of lacy head harness meant to mold the face back into youthful contours overnight. It looked like something between orthodontic headgear and a bonnet designed by a spiteful seamstress. Women would wrap these ribbons and straps around their jaws and foreheads before bed, hoping to iron out the creases of time through gentle medieval torture. Sweet dreams indeed. Now, if you're wondering whether Victorian gentlemen were also concocting their own strange self-improvement potions, the answer is yes. But they were often too preoccupied with moustache waxes and worrying about gout to get into skin poison. Still, every now and then, a man might dabble in some arsenic or ammonia of his own. Love knows no bounds after all. And while we're drifting here on this cloud of blooming nightshade and arsenic-laced elegance, let's remember that what we call absurd today was once simply fashionable. Entire industries bloomed like so many toxic hothouse flowers, all in pursuit of the perfect silk-smooth, candlelit complexion. Some wore veils in public to protect their skin from the judgment of both sun and society. Others flocked to secret beauty parlors for what were called electrical facials, which, yes, involved being gently zapped with static electricity in hopes of invigorating the dermis into a jubilant bounce. The aesthetic equivalent of sticking your face into a sock drawer during a thunderstorm. So next time your skincare routine feels excessive, when you find yourself layering on serums with names like witch hazel mist or reverse time peptides, just remember, at least you're not ingesting arsenic over breakfast or tying your face up like a Victorian ham in pursuit of eternal youth. But perhaps the most astonishing part of all this wasn't the poisons or the peculiar gadgets. It was the secret belief, whispered among friends and murmured in beauty parlors, that there had to be something else, something more natural, something better. And so, gently now, let's drift toward the quiet origins of the Victorian obsession with skincare rituals made from gardens, attics, and the occasional farmer's pantry. They say beauty is pain, but in Victorian times, beauty was often equal parts danger, discomfort, and just a splash of what we'll generously call imagination. Imagine, if you will, the flickering glow of gaslight reflecting off a face powdered whiter than a ghost at a tea party. A lady gently pats her cheeks with a sponge dipped in something that smells suspiciously like old coins and regret. That, dear listener, would be lead. Because when the Victorians said they wanted porcelain skin, they really meant it, complete with the risk of slow, graceful poisoning. Ah yes, welcome to the dangerously dewy world of Victorian facial powders, toners, and all manner of epidermal experimentation. Asleep yet? No? Splendid. Let's drift further. You see, in the fog-drenched streets of 19th century London, having a pale complexion was not just fashionable. It was practically a character reference. It said, "Look at me. I've never been outdoors. I have absolutely no connection to manual labor. And I may, at any moment, faint onto an embroidered sofa." This kind of pallor didn't happen by accident. It was curated, crafted, coaxed lovingly from the face with mixtures that had more in common with alchemy than skincare. Chief among these was Venetian ceruse, an old favorite from the Elizabethan days, which made a charming comeback among Victorian women who craved skin as luminous as a wax apple. Venetian ceruse was made from white lead, vinegar, and a deliberate disregard for long-term health. It certainly gave the impression of perfection, though it also came with side effects such as skin corrosion, chronic headaches, and on occasion, death. But what's a little arsenic between friends, right? Yes, arsenic, the spice of death, and, inexplicably, the secret to a radiant glow. Some women indulged in small doses of arsenic wafers, believing they improved the complexion and softened the skin. And in a way, they were right. Nothing quite says ethereal like a mild case of anemia and digestive distress. Lest you think this madness was confined to the boudoir, rest assured, Victorian innovation knew no boundaries. There was also the rise of toilet vinegars, an oddly named product that had nothing to do with actual toilets and everything to do with fragrance and tone. These concoctions were infused with herbs, flowers, and spices, serving as skincare tonic, perfume, and disguise for the subtly decaying side effects of the previously mentioned lead and arsenic. Meanwhile, blush, the delicate art of pretending one's cheeks had just been kissed by a stray sunbeam, was also under siege by science. Rather than a gentle sweep of colour, many Victorian women applied rouge containing cinnabar or mercuric sulfide. It sounds dangerous because it was. Even Queen Victoria was said to be skeptical about visible makeup, preferring her ladies to look naturally flushed, which ironically can also occur when one is slowly poisoned. Of course, not all techniques were toxic, at least not intentionally. Egg whites were also popular as facial masks. A woman might smear whisked egg across her cheeks before a social event, letting it dry to produce a taut and shiny appearance. Unfortunately, by the end of the evening, it could crack like a dried lake bed. Add in a little candlelight, and you've got yourself a flickering, expressionless face that might have startled the more nervous guests. Curiously, one of the most enduring symbols of beauty was the beauty spot, a tiny dark dot carefully applied to the cheek or near the lip. In previous centuries, these had been made of velvet or mouse skin, yes, actual pieces of rodent, but in the Victorian period, they became more discreet, often just a dab of dark powder. These were placed with strategic flamboyance, each location rumored to carry a secret meaning, flirtatious, mysterious, bold. In effect, they were Tinder before telephones. Swipe left to avoid the one near the nose. Men, lest we forget, were not exempt from the era's beauty theatrics. Some dabbed on powders to reduce shine or dyed their moustaches with walnut juice to maintain a youthful aura. Dandies, those precursors to moderns, influencers, were particularly invested in cultivating the natural look, which required an unnatural amount of effort. So the next time you reach for your gentle cleanser and your dermatologist-approved serum, say a silent thank you to the brave souls who came before us, rubbing metallic dust into their pores and calling it a glow-up. Now then, close your eyes and imagine the quiet rustle of a silk gown, the scent of rosewater vinegar in the air, and the soft clink of a glass jar being opened by candlelight. More secrets await just beyond the powder room. Secrets of curling irons, invisible corsets, and the occasional electroshock, all in the name of allure. Let us now drift through the wisteria-scented drawing rooms of 19th century England, where beauty was not just a pursuit, it was a full-time strategic operation, often involving ingredients better suited to an alchemist's lab than a lady's vanity. Tonight, dear listener, we peer into the delicate art of eyebrow fashion, not plucking, not shaping, but the surprising concept of the Victorian borrowed brow. You see, the Victorians, in all their lace-clad propriety, often faced a predicament. If your eyebrows were too pale, too sparse, or heaven forbid, mismatched, there was but one noble recourse: acquire someone else's, hair that is. Artificial brows crafted from mousehide, yes, mousehide, were known to be a secret weapon among women of society. The tiny patches of fur were expertly snipped and shaped, then delicately glued in place with a little help from bewitching elixirs that might have included tragacanth gum, spirit gum, or, occasionally, fish glue. Just imagine Lady Asphodel Primrose finishing her toilette, applying her brows with the same gravitas one might reserve for a diplomatic treaty, only to sneeze at the Duke's garden party and send one eyebrow spiraling into a punch bowl. The horror, the hush, the scurrying of footmen to recover the rogue tuft before young Miss Bellamy fainted at the scandal of an airborne brow. Startling as it may sound, artificial facial adornments were quite acceptable in polite society, so long as no one mentioned them aloud. A dislodged eyelash might be chalked up to a spirited breeze. A vanishing eyebrow, never spoken of again. It evaporated, as so many secrets did in the powdered atmosphere of Victorian drawing rooms. Now, lest we judge too harshly, consider the sunlight-challenged abodes these women occupied. Gaslight wasn't quite the most flattering medium. and a pair of well-defined brows could mean the difference between ethereal muse and haunted governess. In that gentle but slightly ghostly lighting, expressive eyes framed by tiny strips of mammalian fur made perfect sense, or at least enough sense for Queen Victoria's Britain. And mouse skin, you ask? Why not horsehair or feathers or anything less rodenty? You must remember, the mouse had two irreplaceable qualities going for it: the fine softness of its fur and its utter availability. The smallest of catchments yielded enough material for several eyebrow pairs and perhaps a bonus tuft for an underwhelming moustache. Yes, those weren't just for women. There existed entirely separate, but equally baffling, trades in artificial facial hair for men. We'll save Sir Barnaby Tattersall's misadventures with a reversible faux beard for another time. But back to the brows. Maintaining these tufty charms was no small endeavour. They had to be cleaned, fluffed, and stored. Preferably not where one might confuse them with a dead beetle, or worse, a pastry garnish. Imagine the housemaid popping one on a trifle, mistaking it for a stray berry leaf. Hilarity would presumably not ensue. Of course, not all Victorian women relied on faux brows. Some preferred to dye the real ones dark with soot from oil lamps or crushed elderberries, a practice that inevitably backfired when it rained, and the lady's brows began to trickle down her cheeks like melancholic commas. Others went for the bold act of shaving the brows off entirely, because nothing says mystique like an utterly bewildering forehead. But perhaps the most heartwarming part of this odd little saga lies in how earnestly Victorians pursued beauty. There's a certain charm in their resourcefulness. A woman's toilette might take 2 hours, during which time she would pin false curls, powder her face with arsenical cream, quite literally deadly beauty, and carefully tease 2 mouse pelts into facial harmony. And she did it not because her Instagram followers, being regrettably non-existent, demanded it, but because social decorum and Aunt Petunia's scathing glances left little room for natural follicles. So, next time you misplace an eyebrow pencil, consider our stiff-collared foremothers who tamed vermin for glamour. They may have lacked YouTube tutorials, but they made up for it in pure, powdered determination. Now, as the candle flickers low, and an unseen servant gently shakes a teacup-sized bell for turn-down service, let us whisper onward, for in the next softened breath of our tale, something even stranger awaits. In the realm of eyelashes and parasol shadows, by the time the 1870s rolled around, Victorian ladies had begun to cultivate a rather peculiar relationship with the concept of facial expression. You see, amid the flickering candlelight of high society soirees and the rustle of parasols in manicured gardens, there lurked a growing fear, not of scandal nor of bad weather, but of smiling. Yes, smiling. That stretch of the cheek, the crinkle of the eye, was viewed in some circles as downright reckless. Smiling caused wrinkles, and wrinkles, as you might imagine, were public enemies among the starch collar set. A lady who smiled too much was either dangerously cheerful or, far worse, aging. So quite naturally, in the grand tradition of the Victorians turning everyday occurrences into major aesthetic crises, the anti-smile campaign was born. Enter the beauty mask. Picture, if you will, a delicate young woman preparing for bed in her lace-trimmed boudoir. The fire flickers low, a small clock ticks steadily on the mantel. A maid gently brushes out her mistress's curls, and then, from a drawer lined in satin, emerges what can only be described as the love child of a fencing mask and a cheese grater, constructed of fine wire mesh, stitched silk, and in alarming cases, actual rubber The Victorian beauty mask was a nighttime garment designed to press the face into the model of youthful, firm perfection. Think of it as Victorian Spanx, but for the face. These masks were worn tightly, often laced behind the head like one was preparing to rob a turn-of-the-century train operated exclusively by skin cells. The idea was that, by applying gentle pressure overnight, the mask would prevent the face from shifting into lines, creases, or, heaven forbid, a relaxed and natural smile. The oddity didn't stop at the aesthetic. Some patent-pending versions included copper wiring allegedly infused with electromagnetic rejuvenation, which sounded suspiciously like marketing gibberish and probably felt a lot like sleeping inside a malfunctioning toaster. But the Victorians, ever earnest in pursuit of beauty, persevered. Women slipped into these veiled contraptions nightly, hoping to emerge with a visage as smooth as a boiled egg and half as expressive. And if that weren't quite enough to discourage nocturnal grinning, there were also specialized face supporters, chin straps that held jaws in place, and forehead bands meant to iron out any rogue expressions attempted mid-dream. The poor, unsuspecting husband who woke in the middle of the night might glance over to find what appeared to be a cross between a fencing champion and a dental patient lying demurely on the pillow. But to the Victorian eye, this was not absurd. This was diligence, elegance, even patriotism. After all, one must do their duty for country's honor, corset, and complexion. Medical professionals of the day had mixed feelings. Some warned that these masks could disrupt breathing or cause headaches. Minor details, really, when compared to the risk of a laugh line. Others outright encouraged their use, especially those conveniently employed by the manufacturers themselves. The timeless dance between dermatology and capitalism. And if all that failed, well then, it was time to bring out the complexion glove. Yes, a thick, often sandpapery mitt, meant to exfoliate the face with the tenderness of a sugar-deprived Victrola salesman. Paired with ointments made from everything from mercury to vinegar-soaked bread pulp, it was a nightly routine both barbaric and bizarrely romantic in its commitment. So each evening, the candles were dimmed, the corsets cast aside, and the true battle for beauty commenced. It was a quiet fight, fought in soft gaslight and whispering rooms, one suppressed smirk at a time. And as you begin to feel your muscles relax, mouth tilting into a gentle curve, you can delight quietly in the rebellion of a wrinkle, the impish decadence of a yawn, and the glorious sleep that comes with knowing your face is free range. But should your dreams take you wandering into a mirrored Victorian hallway, beware the softly clicking footsteps of midnight beauty mask wearers. Nod politely, but do not smile. Better to save that for what comes next, where our little journey glides softly into another peculiar element of the past, one just as strange and just as sleepy. Picture this. It's 1870. You're lying on a fainting couch in a London drawing room, sipping tepid cucumber water and wondering why your eyebrows smell faintly of onions. That's not a metaphor. That's just Victorian beauty science. We now arrive at another little-known chapter in the epic saga of Victorian attempts to wrestle nature into submission with lace gloves and side-parted desperation. Eyebrow treatments. You see, the ideal Victorian brow was not the high-glam arch of a 1950s starlet or the aggressively angular shape of a 21st century influencer, but rather a soft, faint, barely there whisper of brow. Think a pale memory of concern, rather than a statement of intent. But if you were unfortunate enough to have dark brows, powerful slashes above your eyes that might suggest willfulness or worse, nonconformity, you needed to take them down a notch. In came the onion. Yes, onion juice, painstakingly dabbed onto the eyebrows each night, was claimed to bleach dark hairs over time, soothingly erasing character from the face until everyone looked like they'd been painted in watercolors and mild regret. Of course, the whole house would weep as the vaporous serum worked its way into the skin. But beauty, after all, required sacrifice, or at least the steady application of root vegetables. Now, for those lacking in the brow department, not enough hair, not enough commitment to the weary Victorian aesthetic, there was another solution. Mouse skin, as in actual shaved bits of rodents, carefully glued where the brow should be. That's right. Artificial eyebrows made from mouse fur were the TikTok dupe of their day. You could remove them at night, brush them out, maybe even name them. Good night, Gerald. Sleep tight, Winifred. Replaceable, fashionable, and ever so slightly disturbing, these furry adornments offered changeability and convenience, like hats for your face. It's said that during high society dances, more than one rogue brow skittered off a perspiring forehead and ended up tragically stuck to someone else's shoulder. Or worse, shared an unexpected moment with a trifle in the dessert course. But why stop at eyebrows? The Victorian fascination with facial hair extended to the lashes as well. Long eyelashes were apparently a sign of purity and demureness, perhaps because impure people didn't have time to flutter sweetly. Alas, unless genetics had gifted you generous fringe around the eyes, you might consider semi-surgical enhancement, which did not mean extensions, mascara, or a trip to the beauty counter. It meant sewing. Literally sewing. Tiny human hairs, often taken from your head or someone else's, depending on your level of enthusiasm, were threaded onto a fine needle and stitched delicately into the eyelid's edge. With no laughs, no anesthesia, and very little in the way of safety measures. Imagine lying back, staring up at the ceiling decorated with pictures of fern fronds, while a terribly proper woman in a bonnet gently perforated your lash line. With kindness and a stew of questionable technique. There's probably a reason this didn't quite catch on. Or rather, it did catch, but occasionally in a rather literal sense. In the event all these natural enhancements weren't your cup of painfully overboiled tea, you could always turn to the wonderful world of belladonna drops. Extracted from the deadly nightshade plant, the drops were administered into the eyes, causing the pupils to dilate and creating an alluring, dreamy expression, also described by doctors as possibly permanent blindness. Still, if looking vaguely enchanted while bumping into furniture was the price of high fashion, many obliged. Belladonna, after all, comes from an Italian term meaning beautiful lady, which is glamorous, until you remember it was also what witches allegedly used to fly. Small detail. It seems the Victorian face was a playground, though perhaps more of a haunted playground at midnight than a sunny one with a slide. One moment you're sprinkling onion on your face. The next, you're gluing a hairpiece harvested from a field mouse to your forehead while your pupils expand like you just saw the ghost of Queen Elizabeth. And yet, they did it all in pursuit of a very specific, very peculiar ideal. Fragile beauty that whispered rather than shouted. Unless your eyebrows fell into someone's soup, then they definitely shouted. Let us now leave the parlour and those delicately stitched eyelashes behind and wander gently toward a different part of the Victorian toilette, where powders turned into poison and no one ever quite asked enough questions about lead. By the dim lamplight of drawing rooms and gaslit boudoir, amid the veil of muslin and mothballs, Victorian ladies, the kind who favoured pressed violets and poetry that rhymed, harboured a particular obsession with the shimmer of eyes. Not the sparkle that comes from the conversation with a handsome baronet, nor the gleam inspired by a secret diary entry about forbidden gooseberry jam. No, we speak here of actual luminescent eyes. A symptom, more or less, of the 19th century's deeply held belief that if something tingled or burned slightly, it was probably improving you. And so it was that Victorian women turned to belladonna, yes, the literal deadly nightshade, as an eye drop. A few drops extracted from this elegant but malicious plant would widen the pupils into deep, dough-like saucers, lending women a dreamy, glassy-eyed gaze which screamed, "I am lovely, mysterious, possibly swooning." It wasn't named belladonna or beautiful lady for nothing. To the Victorian mind, slightly poisonous charisma was infinitely preferable to looking alert and rational. No one wanted to resemble a shopkeeper with working hours. They wanted hypnotic eyes that could suggest they might faint into your arms at any moment, or recite Keats without blinking. Emotional fragility, but make it fashionable. Of course, there were small side effects, like blurred vision, extreme sensitivity to light, or in some cases, permanent blindness. But sacrifices had to be made. Beauty, in an era that also thought corsets and arsenic wafers were good decisions, was never about comfort. It was a lifelong tightrope walk between allure and organ failure. Beyond eye drops, the Victorians also dabbled in dramatic facial expressions as a form of cosmetic enhancement. A subtle smile in a portrait wouldn't do. They wanted the cheeks pink with life, even if life itself said, "I'm out, please stop." To achieve that rosy glow, women pinched their own cheeks before visitors arrived. It was nature's blush, only far less relaxing. For those with a bit more spare change and substantially fewer nerve endings, there was the option of applying red mercuric sulfide, also known as vermilion, right onto the face. A brilliant scarlet powder used originally in art and Chinese lacquerware. But sure, absolutely, let's put it on our mouths. A dab on the lips gave one the look of a sanguine siren. Sadly, after continued contact, it also gave one the look of someone coming down with heavy metal poisoning. There's something timelessly chaotic about this level of effort, a sort of aristocratic DIY spirit, wielded with the confident grace of someone who both hosts a tea at 4 and may accidentally alchemize themselves. And since we're speaking of unwitting acts of self-alteration, we can't ignore the habit of replacing eyebrows with something frankly haunting. Shaven brows were all the rage among certain subsets of the fashion elite. Why? Well, who needs horizontal face decorations when you could glue tiny bits of mouse fur where God once intervened? Yes, mouse fur, trimmed, shaped, and applied lovingly with a dab of gum arabic. Imagine the still silence of a Victorian dressing room, the clink of a pearl-handled brush, the distant sound of a horse snorting outside, and in the mirror, a woman lovingly spreading rodent pelts upon her face. It was all about achieving that light, aristocratic look, as though you were born without brows because you've never had to look surprised. Still, one must give credit where it's tragically due. The ladies of the Victorian era flirted with toxins and taxidermy for the sake of elegance. They were, in their own way, the early pioneers of avant-garde contouring. Their cosmetic cabinets were little more than chemistry sets with lace doilies. And while today we may question the wisdom of voluntarily inserting deadly plants into one's optical regions, we cannot question their commitment or their optic nerve damage. So next time you consider trying a new skincare trend that promises instant glow, remember the Victorian women, eyes wide from belladonna, cheeks sore from pinching, lips painted with mercury, and browed like a noble rodent. They were the blueprint, albeit hand-inked and slightly smudged. Now, as our little journey presses further through lace-curtained rituals and eyebrow-related mysteries, we find ourselves drifting, slower, softer, into the hushed secrets hiding beneath the frivolity. For the Victorians, even powder carried tales of empire, chemistry, and delicate denial. By the flickering light of coal-fueled lamps, amidst the gentle rattle of a carriage on cobbled streets, the Victorian woman set out each day in a pursuit of the most elusive, most sought-after prey in all of history, beauty. And Victorian beauty, as it turns out, had some unconventional demands. Where modern trends whisper of minimalism and micellar water, our 19th century heroines had a more vivid imagination. Case in point, lead-based face cream. Yes, lead. As in the stuff we now use caution tape and hazmat suits around. Imagine yourself standing before a grand walnut vanity, heavy velvet curtains drawn close to filter the harsh daylight. You take a small pot, enameled of course, in a shade of pale pink that Victorian society deemed delicately feminine, and unscrew the lid. Inside a cold, white paste awaits. It smells faintly of rosewater with a whisper of impending doom. This, dear dreamer, is Venetian ceruse, a concoction of vinegar and white lead, once used to create a complexion so pale it threatened to ghost any passing spirit. To be clear, using this paste routinely often led to skin corrosion, facial paralysis, and slowly poisoning oneself into a state of gentle, aristocratic ruin. But such was the price of ethereal beauty. A ghostly pallor signified class and leisure. It said, "I have never tilled a field in my life. My soil is imported." Now, lest we judge too harshly, let us remember that in the absence of sunscreen, Instagram filters, and reliable plumbing, your average Victorian woman was working with limited tools and an abundance of dreams. Besides, what's a little mercury poisoning in the grand waltz of high society? Speaking of peculiar practices, nothing quite says "good night, your ladyship," like slathering yourself in night creams enriched with ammonia. Not the fluffy science skincare kind. Real ammonia. The kind that could knock your bonnet off if sniffed too enthusiastically. Often derived from fermented animal urine. Yes, you heard that correctly. The price of porcelain skin, it seems, was a pungent night's rest. Let's not forget hair care. Also a thrilling corner in the Victorian beauty labyrinth. In popular women's magazines of the time, readers were encouraged to rinse their locks with onion juice to enhance shine. That's right, onion juice. A deeply tearful experience both literally and socially. Whether or not it left one's hair lustrous remains up for debate, but one can only imagine the impact on courtship rituals. Come closer, Reginald. I smell of antioxidants and potent soup base. And should your hairline threaten to retreat, perish the thought, there were products advertised to stimulate regrowth. Like macassar oil, a concoction so greasy that it caused an epidemic of ruined upholstery. Enter the invention of the antimacassar, a small decorative fabric placed on the backs of chairs, not for charm, but to protect Grandma's velvet from bacon-slicked heads. Madame's beauty rituals often didn't end at the neck. Oh no. Let us meander briefly down to the realm of the bust enhancer. Victorian corsets, while famous already for their waist-defying feats, came in more specialized varieties than modern stocking refresh buttons at online sales. There were bust improvers, essentially padded pillows tied politely under the bodice, and often filled with everything from horsehair to actual bird feathers. This is not metaphor. One attic find revealed sachets marked Canada Goose Down, discreet elegance. Meanwhile, artificial dimples, considered very fetching, were created using spring-mounted devices worn secretly under the cheeks to pinch the skin into indentations. Picture a mousetrap for your face with the goal of flirtation, not pest control. One false move and your courtship smile became a grimace of mild physical duress. It's easy, under the soft cloud of hindsight, to titter at these efforts from a distance, but we must also praise the sheer persistence. The Victorians didn't simply wait for beauty. They invented it, repackaged it in silver tins, soaked lace in it, and hoped no one noticed if it peeled their eyebrows off in the process. As the gaslight gutters low and the perfume of rosewater tries valiantly to mask the ammonia-tinged yesternight, we might wonder, how far would we go in the modern age had we not been born with instructions in SPF? Fold your satin gloves neatly, fluff your antimacassar, and rest easy, because our next stop involves an entirely different kind of beautification device, one that was wound up, strapped in, and occasionally plugged into a wall. Imagine, if you will, drifting gently through the faded parlour curtains of a proper Victorian drawing room. Morning light spills in like a polite visitor, soft, indirect, and never overstaying its welcome. In this hush of domestic tranquility, there's an unusual clinking from the dressing table, not the clink of dainty teaspoons in porcelain cups, but the telling clatter of scientific ambition meeting feminine beauty. Over sulfuric acid and powdered zinc. Because tonight, dear listener, we arrive at what might be the most electrifying Victorian beauty secret of them all. Electrotherapy facials. Yes, Victorian ladies voluntarily zap themselves in the face. For beauty. Let's build the scene with all the shimmer and scandal it deserves. It's the 1880s, and the mysteries of electricity are only just being unravelled. Alexander Graham Bell's invention is still warm. Thomas Edison's light bulb is humming to life, and the average Brit is trying to decide whether this newfangled current is a work of the devil or simply divine. But amidst this turmoil of modern miracles, physicians and pseudo-doctors alike stumbled upon an arresting proposal. What if electricity could rejuvenate not just your lamps, but your very skin? Enter the Electromedical Institute's Pulvermacher chain, a glorified necklace of copper and zinc coils, worn snugly under the bonnet, like Cleopatra, but with more risk of accidental electrocution. It claimed to invigorate the facial tissues, stimulate the flow of blood, and restore youthful bloom. Other devices offered a handheld wand through which tiny sparks, called Faradic currents, could be delivered to the cheeks with a soft tingle or a gentle yelp, depending on your pain threshold and marital status. Women swore by it. Their cheeks may have buzzed like an agitated bumblebee, but at least they looked like rose petals by candlelight. Allegedly. You'll be pleased to know that practices varied wildly. Some applied metal rollers, others used wet sponges attached to backyard battery units, which, if used improperly, could leave you with more than just blushing cheeks. Perhaps lightly smoked hair and the scent of adventure. The beloved Lady Violet Hargraves, a socialite of considerable charm and truly questionable judgment, was often seen emerging from her electrotherapy sessions with a faint halo of static around her curls. Rumour has it, she once lit the lamp gas just by smiling at it. Was she secretly a sorceress? No, just slightly conductive. And yet, In spite of the occasional arc and sizzle, there was a rather soothing belief humming beneath the science that there was hope within those sparks of reversing time. The Victorians feared aging the way one might fear improper lace placement at dinner, deeply and melodramatically. Wrinkles, they decided, were a sort of moral failing, a sign that one had perhaps not moisturized with cod liver oil often enough, or worse, had been too expressive with the eyebrows. Electricity then became a symbol, not just of progress, but of possible perfection. The mystique of the flickering filament housed, rather romantically, the dream of remaining forever just 27. And so the crackle and buzz of battery-powered rejuvenation became almost fashionable, an upper-crust pastime, like embroidery, but with a higher chance of temporary paralysis. Doctors, some qualified, most not, set up electro-beauty parlors. One could recline like a Grecian statue, perhaps on a velvet chaise, while delicate streams of current hinted at the rejuvenation of both face and fortune. Testimonials declared that after 6 sessions, one's complexion would glow, possibly because of better blood flow, possibly because of mild third-degree burns. Now, should you wonder whether any of this actually worked, here's the honest truth. Mildly, very mildly. Gentle stimulation does increase circulation after all, and blood flow is indeed good for the skin. But the bulk of the transformation came not from actual dermatological effect, but from the heady fusion of belief, hope, and the occasional lightning bolt to the chin. Eventually, the charm wore off. Electricity, once the glamorous stranger, became the mundane companion of kettles and street lamps. Facial zappers were quietly shelved, tucked away beside the arsenic lotion and belladonna eye drops. Another curious footnote in the saga of attempting eternal youth, with gadgets that would terrify modern-day electricians. But the buzz of those bygone beauty methods still echoes in the quiet corners of history. For what is fashion, if not the delicate dance between vanity and the available technology? Let your eyes drift now, past the softly humming battery packs of yesteryear, past the static-laced coiffeurs and gently singed eyebrows. Something else fizzes just ahead, a beauty ritual not zap-powered, but altogether darker and stickier. With any luck, it won't smell like boiled horses, but we make no promises. Now, let us drift gently down another ivy-wrapped corridor of Victorian vanity, one that smells faintly of vinegar and misplaced optimism. For tonight, we delve into the tale of the vinegar-soaked handkerchief, also known as a lady's portable complexion cure, or, more honestly, a damp napkin that promised miracles and mostly delivered a headache. In the 19th century, women's complexions were held to an utterly impossible standard. Moonlight on porcelain, kissed by angels, and somehow immune to both gravity and sunshine. This led to some breathtaking creativity, and not in the inspiring sense. No, more in the gasping for air after sniffing vinegar kind of way. You see, Victorians deeply feared 2 things: coarse pores and the sun. Both were thought to be the harbingers of social decay. A sun-touched cheek in a woman meant, well, she had probably been outside without a parasol. Scandalous. So the solution, as with so many things in the Victorian era, involved vinegar. Vinegar was the Windex of the 1800s. They splashed it on everything and insisted it cured all ills. What better substance, then, to preserve the miracle of milky skin? Ladies would carry dainty little handkerchiefs in their refined reticules, those adorable, handbags that were somehow both charming and entirely impractical. Each square of linen lovingly spritzed with vinegar, rose water, and sometimes a whisper of ammonia. Yes, ammonia. Truly, nothing says romance like dabbing your temples with household cleaning products. The idea was to press the soaked cloth to one's face throughout the day, rehydrating the skin, soothing irritation, and, if you were lucky, only mildly fizzing upon contact. Some women swore it tightened the pores and brought a pale bloom to their cheeks. Others just passed out after prolonged inhalation. But of course, this being the Victorian era, a simple handkerchief wasn't nearly convoluted enough. So emerged the invention of the vinegar sponge, a bread-like hunk of sponge soaked in perfume vinegar and stuffed into a silver vinaigrette holder. Not a salad dressing container, mind you, though the name is tragically confusing. Vinaigrettes were tiny lockets, often worn on a chain or ribbon, containing fragrant sponges tucked inside delicate filigree. If a fainting spell threatened, which it often did, courtesy of corsets, heat, and societal expectations, a lady would whip out her vinaigrette, inhale sharply, and be restored, or at least startled back into partial consciousness. It doubled as a feminist statement, really. No, I shall not faint from your nonsense, Reginald. I shall sniff this vinegar sponge and endure. There were endless variations. Some women used lemon juice to bleach the skin, achieving that ever-elusive look somewhere between ethereal waif and medically concerning. Others concocted tonics of egg whites and vinegar as facial masks, which, yes, set like concrete and yes, smelled like a Caesar salad gone rogue. But vinegar wasn't just for the face. Oh no. Ever the versatile potion, it was used for hair as well, mixed with oils and herbs to add shine. The only problem? The scent lingered. Many a Victorian dinner guest radiated the unmistakable aura of a well-dressed potato chip. Still, no secret was kept for long in that society of tea and tattletales. Recipes for these vinegar elixirs were shared between friends in curled, perfumed letters, scribbled into cookbooks, or murmured at garden parties between increasingly dizzy women. And though today we might balk at dousing our faces in pickling solution, the concept of a facial mist continues, rebranded, blissfully ammonia-free, and available in Instagrammable pastel bottles. The beauty of Victorian beauty, if you'll pardon the circular phrasing, lay not in its actual success, but in the dreamy obstinance of it all. A belief that, with enough lace and lemons, the world could be kept at bay. And so, as our handkerchiefs dry in the night air and the vinegar haze fades into gentle dreams, we turn, softly, toward the next curious concoction in this twilight waltz through powdered cheeks and peculiar creams. While today's skincare enthusiasts dabble in retinol serums and sheet masks infused with snail mucus, and yes, that is a real thing, our Victorian ancestors flirted with beauty routines that read more like chemistry final exams written by someone having a nervous breakdown. Let us drift now into a candlelit boudoir, anchored somewhere around 1875, where a young woman, Miss Cordelia Featherstone, prepares herself for yet another tedious evening of socially sanctioned flirtation. With a sigh audible through 3 layers of petticoats, she stands before her vanity, wielding an eyebrow brush like a skeptical swordswoman. Victorian beauty, like most Victorian things, was equal parts aspiration, superstition, and dangerous proximity to household poisons. Cordelia begins, of course, with the most divine of rituals, arsenic wafers. Yes, arsenic, the element more commonly associated with Agatha Christie novels, suspicious widows, and the abrupt departure of inconvenient heirs. But back then, arsenic was the skincare darling of many a delicate face. Packaged into dainty little tablets and sold under names like Dr. Rose's arsenic complexion wafers, they promise to deliver a flawless pallor and banish freckles, blemishes, and perhaps anyone who dared kiss you on the cheek too enthusiastically. The logic went like this. Just a tiny dose of poison would slow your system down, suppressing natural functions like digestion, and, irritatingly, breathing if you weren't careful. But above all, it delivered that fashionable paper-white complexion that told everyone, I've never tilled a field in my life. A healthy glow was for peasants. A sickly glow. Now that, darling, was aristocratic. Cordelia takes a wafer with the same weary resolve of someone accepting a third cousin's invitation to the annual family picnic. She chases it with a sip of violet water, not because it helped the arsenic go down, but because its floral fragrance hinted at wealth, mystery, and possibly a love letter from someone with sideburns and a tragic past. Her next stop in the beauty gauntlet, belladonna drops. Derived from the deadly nightshade plant and clearly not named by someone who understood irony, these eye drops were applied to enlarge the pupils, mimicking the dilated gaze of a love-struck heroine staring at nothing in particular across a foggy moor. Enlarged pupils were thought to make women appear more alluring, which might be why so few people questioned if romance really should resemble a persistent case of blurry tunnel vision. The drops stung naturally. That kind of burning allure cannot be manufactured gently. But if Cordelia's eyes ran red with tears, so much the better. Women in Victorian novels are always teetering on the emotional edge of something, whether it be passion, poverty, or yet another marriage proposal from a man who smells faintly of livestock and entitlement. After her ocular ordeal, Cordelia moves to the pièce de résistance of her evening preparations, her nightly lead cream. Made from white lead and vinegar, this concoction produced a finish as smooth as royal porcelain and nearly as toxic. Used over time, it could erode the skin, cause black splotches, and slowly poison the user. But for now, it dabbed on with a satisfyingly creamy consistency, masking freckles and worries with equal efficiency. The not-so-well-kept secret of Victorian beauty was that it was often less about health and more about plausible death. The ideal woman was quiet, fragile, and looked as though she might faint at the sound of a strong adjective. Through a mix of corsetry, social repression, and voluntary poisoning, beauty was a slow waltz with entropy. As Cordelia contemplates her pale reflection, powdering her nose with crushed pearl dust, or ground oyster shells depending on the household budget, she considers herself ready. She is not radiant. She is not glowing. She is precisely the sort of wan and wayfish that would make a poet throw himself into a pond. The evening ball awaits. She will spend it conversing about lace, whist, and the weather's effect on her ankles. Her pupils may be dilated, but her enthusiasm is not. And yet, in her own way, she shines, as do all who endure the peculiar rigors of fashion with grace and very slight nausea. Next time, we shall lace up our metaphorical boots and tiptoe into one of the more hair-raising practices of Victorian grooming. Quite literally, somewhere between the chime of gas lamps and the rustle of crinoline skirts, Victorian women found themselves facing a serious cosmetic dilemma. How to achieve the perfect, elegant hand. You see, soft, pale, lily-white hands were more than a mere dainty accessory. They were practically a resume. Calloused knuckles or tanned wrists might as well have shouted, "I work for a living," which, in the social jungle of 19th century Britain, was not exactly fashionable. In this quiet corner of cosmetic history lies one of the era's lesser-known obsessions: hand-whitening creams. Not just any creams, but elaborate potions whipped together with mysterious ingredients and the occasional dash of accidental poison. With packaging ornate enough to make a Fabergé egg blush, these hand lotions often made bold promises and contained even bolder choices, like lead, mercury, or ammonia. Apparently, a little potential neurological damage was a fair trade for not resembling a scullery maid. Some formulas boasted crushed pearl powder, how very oceanic, or lactic acid from sour milk, less glamorous, and perhaps a hint of benzoin resin, extracted from tropical trees and likely brought on ships alongside spices and cannonballs. These potions were slathered on before bed, often with the hands then slid into thin cotton gloves, as though preparing for a midnight waltz you hoped no one would ever actually invite you to. And yet, the quest for unblemished, doll-like hands didn't stop at ointments. No, that would be far too pedestrian. If you had a touch of extra coin and an adventurous spirit, you might indulge in a rather peculiar ritual known as hand steaming. This involved sitting serenely while your hands were placed in little boxes, through which warm herbal vapors wafted like a spa date with a tea kettle. It was believed to coax the skin into buttery softness and lighten any offending freckles left by the sun's vulgar affection. The only thing missing was a string quartet playing gently from the drawing room. Gloves, too, were not just fashion accessories, but strategic armor. Women wore them obsessively outdoors and even indoors on occasion, lest a stray sunbeam tan a knuckle. But in some cases, the gloves themselves were therapeutic, infused with almond oil or lanolin, and designed to moisturize stealthily while one sipped tea and judged the cut of a gentleman's waistcoat. The hands were to remain mysterious, untouchable, almost as though they existed solely for the turning of pages in a diary or the delicate lifting of a petit four. But soft hands alone were not enough. Oh no, fingernails must not be neglected. They too were scrubbed with lemon juice to bleach away signs of carrot peeling or potentially scandalous embroidery. Manicure sets became fashionable gifts, comprising tiny scissors, ivory-handled pushers, and nail buffers stuffed with chamois leather. It was the rise of the domestic spa moment, tucked into a velvet-lined box. Yet there is something quietly charming about this devotion to hands, those small, expressive tools so easily overlooked. The Victorians, in their own peculiar and faintly perilous way, understood that hands told stories, that they spoke without words, and above all, that no letter penned in violet ink or bracelet clasped with a sigh would feel quite the same unless performed with hands as pale and soft as moonlit fog. Of course, whether these rituals truly transformed one's hands into silky monuments of femininity is debatable. Some gained ghostly white knuckles, but also a tendency to faint near fireplaces, thanks to that mercury seeping through the skin. Others developed rashes from their steamy herbal adventures, but carried their blotches with stubborn grace, convinced that true elegance demands a little suffering. So next time you reach for your modern hand cream, not poisonous, one hopes, and smear it on between emails and grocery lists, remember the gloves, the steams, the scented pastes with unpronounceable ingredients. And take a moment to appreciate your own rather miraculous mitts, however patched or practical they may be. After all, every hand has a history. Some just happen to come with a side of arsenic. And if you thought hand whitening was intense, just wait until we gently tiptoe into the curious case of Victorian eyebrow etiquette. They say beauty is pain, but in Victorian England, beauty was more like a laboratory accident crossed with a séance. Just when you think you've heard of every odd cosmetic concoction cradled inside a porcelain jar, along comes something truly electrifying. Tonight, dear Dreamwalker, we delve into the world of Victorian electrotherapy, specifically the use of electrical contraptions to reinvigorate the face, tighten those chin muscles, and give a lady the kind of radiant glow one only gets from a mild household electrocution. Let's dim the gas lamps and unplug, carefully, the early beauty gadgets they called electrical facial stimulators. Picture this: a delicate lady in a corseted silk dress, reclining in her drawing room, having her cheekbones gently zapped by a handheld device that buzzed like a caffeinated mosquito and was powered by wet cell batteries containing genuine sulfuric acid. Romantic, isn't it? The Victorian era was smitten with electricity. It was new, marvelously misunderstood, and suspected of curing everything from headaches to heartbreaks. Enterprising beauty gurus of the time leapt upon this buzzing bandwagon and invented devices with names like the Pulvermacher chain or the electromagnetic beautifier. They resembled either medieval torture tools or curious pieces of jewelry that had lost an argument with a dynamo. One popular model featured little metallic pads pressed onto one's temples and cheeks, held in place with an elegant, albeit slightly menacing, leather strap. The effect was described, quite politely, as tingling, though personal diaries suggest it felt more like a bee had taken etiquette lessons and was now politely stinging in Morse code. Why go to all this trouble? The electrical current, Victorians believed, could reawaken lazy facial muscles and improve complexion by stimulating the blood flow, sort of like yelling at your cheeks until they blushed out of sheer embarrassment. There was even a belief that using such devices could prevent the terrible slackening of the chin, a horrifying fate nobody wished upon even their worst enemy or least liked second cousin. Now, these galvanic treatments, as they were sometimes called, didn't stop at personal use. Beauty parlors, those elegant havens of scented powders and whispered gossip, began offering electric facials for the well-to-do and somewhat curious. Of course, to undergo one of these salon sessions, you'd need to sign a delicate waiver with your monocle pointed respectfully downward, particularly since these treatments occasionally left the face with a charming, if temporary, twitch. Meanwhile, Victorian advertisements for electro-beauty devices cranked the drama to Shakespearean levels. They featured illustrations of wide-eyed women practically glowing with radiance, presumably because their face hadn't stopped twitching since lunchtime. The text promised a bloom of youth and instant rejuvenation. In truth, one might simply develop an unusual attraction to thunderclouds and a keen sensitivity to doorknobs. It's worth noting that not all these gadgets were powered by true electricity. Some were purely mechanical, designed to look scientific rather than to function. Others did allow a genuine, if feeble, current to course through the user's cheeks and forehead. The strength of the shock depended on how brave or sleep-deprived you were feeling. One brave reviewer in an 1890s magazine described feeling as though a squirrel had scrambled directly through my jawbone. And of course, in true Victorian fashion, there was also the social angle. For a time, hosting an electric night was a novelty among fashionable circles. Ladies might gather, sip elderflower cordial, and partake in mild cosmetic electrocution while discussing the scandalous length of Lady Witherbottom's hemlines or Mr. Pritchard's mysterious disappearance from the croquet club. The devices themselves were wonderfully ornate, housed in velvet-lined boxes with brass switches and inscribed labels. They often looked like something you might find in a wizard's travel kit, or a particularly optimistic toolbox from Frankenstein's more fashionable cousin. Some even played music as the electricity worked its way under your dermis, just in case electroconvulsive romance needed a soundtrack. Yet even as the fashion waned, replaced by creams, tonics, and eventually cold cream and cinema, the electric facelift of the 19th century remains a tiny jolt of beauty history, a reminder that humans have always pursued radiance in mysterious, mildly alarming ways. So tonight, as your eyelids hum with drowsy anticipation, imagine someone adjusting the dial on your cheekbone-setting device, preparing you for flawless dreams and zero chin sag. And to understand just how far these electrifying ideas went, we may next wander into the realms of beauty sleep secrets that had very little to do with rest and much more to do with raw beef and floral guilt, somewhere between the scent of lavender sachets and the melancholy warble of a canary in a lace-draped sitting room. Victorians made one of their most committed beauty errors. They tried to bake themselves pretty. No, not with cupcakes, though that would have been more effective and delicious. You see, in an era when a porcelain complexion was the epitome of elegance and moral superiority, women sought out the kind of pallor that said, "Have I been seriously ill for 6 months? Maybe," but in a refined sort of way. The sun was an enemy, a vulgar illuminator of freckles and, heaven forbid, melanin. So women swaddled themselves in bonnets wider than carriage wheels, carried parasols like portable shadows, and, indoors, turned to a quaint little device called the complexion steamer. Imagine a small bubbling cauldron connected to a funnel-fashioned mask that you lowered onto your face like a very determined beekeeper. Hot steam, allegedly infused with rosewater or almond milk, and hopefully not something worse, would rise up and bathe the skin in moist Victorian optimism. The goal? To open the pores, purify the skin, and possibly boil your nose off. More than one lady wrote letters to the Queen magazine, the Vogue of its day, minus Vogue's perplexing fashion editorials, complaining of minor burns, light blistering, or the unfortunate incident of a frontal curl getting steamed into submission like overcooked tagliatelle. But even that wasn't quite enough damage. You see, in the iron stove of beauty experimentation, more heat was considered better. So some inventive soul invented the heated facial mask. This glorious contraption was essentially a metal grid, heated from within by embers or later, via dangerous electrical means, strapped onto one's face like a medieval punishment for unpretty thoughts. It's hard to say which was worse, the scalding or the press of metal etching temporary facial tattoos in swirls and squares. But in that era, the phrase "no pain, no gain" was apparently taken as a genuine step-by-step plan. And so, we arrive at the curious intersection of cosmetics and coal. Because yes, coal entered the powder room, activated charcoal before it became the darling of wellness influencers stirring it into overpriced water, had another moment of glory under Queen Victoria. Back in the late 19th century, some beauty theorists proposed that ingesting small amounts of activated charcoal could purify the body from within and therefore improve the skin. In practice, this meant sipping a murky, black, mineral-scented beverage before bed, grimacing heroically, and pretending it didn't taste like a fireplace in liquid form. Externally, charcoal also made its way into face masks and scrubs, supposedly drawing out imperfections, though one wonders what they considered an imperfection in an era when a single freckle could earn you a lifetime of lace collars. Of course, nothing draws out imperfections quite like literally drawing on the skin. Here enters the art of veins. Since paleness was prized, it became fashionable, especially among the higher classes, to draw faint blue veins onto the skin to emphasize just how translucent and bloodless one seemed. Using blue pencil, powdered lapis pigment, or in some cases, indigo ink. Women traced tiny thoracic rivers across their décolletage or wrists, like a roadmap to terminal elegance. A well-executed vein display said, "I am so refined, even my blood is subtle." A poorly executed one made you look like you had attempted amateur tattooing while slightly dizzy from the lead powders. Romantic, isn't it? And it wasn't just the women. Oh no. Some gentlemen, particularly those in the theatrical or courtly professions, dabbled in skin-lightening practices of their own. Imagine Sir Reginald of Somewhereshire, applying arsenic wafers and face paste, powdering his cheeks while perfecting his brooding squint in the mirror. Victorian masculinity came in many shades, most of them ghostly, but among the loveliness and lunacy, one must appreciate the level of commitment. Whatever the risk, many a Victorian bather of skin believed, deeply and with great poise, that true beauty was within reach, even if reaching required tweezers, poisons, and a momentary bout of fainting. Now, as we draw the lace curtain on this scene of steaming masks and sketched-on veins, let us tiptoe softly into the next chamber of curious cosmetics, a place where the flutter of eyelashes demanded reinvention, even if it involved sewing needles and silk thread. As we meander deeper into the dimly lit boudoirs and rose-scented parlours of the Victorian age, let us pause and adjust our lorgnettes to examine one of the most curious beauty practices of the era, the pursuit of eternally flushed cheeks via what can only be described as the most delicate form of intentional poisoning. Now, in the candle-lit corridors of Victorian fashion, rogue cheeks weren't just a sign of youthful enthusiasm. No, they were practically mandatory. Pale faces were passé. A subtle blush meant health, vitality, and a very convincing illusion that one had just finished a brisk walk along an English moor, or perhaps had received a mildly scandalous letter from a French suitor. But for those unfortunate enough not to blush on command, or who were too dignified to stoop to mere exercise, the answer was simple. Apply a tiny, nearly invisible layer of rouge, made from lead, mercury, or, if you really wanted to go for that elusive, dead but dazzling look, carmine extracted from crushed cochineal insects. Yes, nothing said refined elegance, quite like smearing the dried remains of Mexican beetles onto your face. Of course, the fancier sort might opt for Spanish papers, which sounds like a well-bred periodical, but were in fact thin, perfumed sheets dabbed with red pigment. These were smuggled into tea parties and opera boxes, then coyly dabbed across the cheeks when no one was looking. Think of them as the Victorian version of a discreet Snapchat filter, but fueled by mystery and occasional heavy metals. Let's not forget the tonifying secrets of belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, which some women dropped into their eyes to dilate their pupils and appear more entrancing. It did, in fairness, create an eerie, luminous stare that Victorian poets described as hypnotic and toxicologists described as pre-blindness. Small price to pay for captivating the Earl of Wherever over a cold scone and murmured compliments at a soirée. Blush, however, was special. Unlike eyebrow darkeners or questionable lip stains, rouge had emotional gravitas. You weren't just applying colour to your cheeks. You were crafting an illusion of sensitivity. A well-placed flush implied a nervously thrilling life filled with horse-drawn flirtation, secret engagements, and the occasional stumble at a garden party that led to marriage and 3 novels worth of misunderstandings. Now, the Victorians Victorians, didn't always appreciate a woman painting her face too openly. You see, cosmetics were associated with actresses, and women of even lower repute, actresses who winked no less. So, while many did indeed rouge themselves up like a ripe summer peach, it was often done in secret, behind closed curtains, and with the solemnity of a minor religious ritual. Hence, the discreet pinch method became popular among the more modest set. That's right. Women would sit in drawing rooms and lightly beat themselves about the cheeks to summon a fleeting natural blush, a spot of self-flagellation in the name of decorum. Even more dedicated rouges applied vinegar and ammonia-based mixtures to lightly irritate the skin, creating an effect that technically meant a gentle flirtation with chemical burns, all under the guise of meeting an acceptable glow halfway between romantic and did she just fall down the stairs. And just when you think it couldn't get any more intriguing, it does. Some women, perhaps inspired by the physiology of tomatoes or flushed from reading too much Keats, took small doses of arsenic to achieve a permanent rosy complexion. Yes, arsenic, the classic ingredient of every polite murder mystery and questionable beauty routine. The idea was that a pinch a day would make the skin luminous and also maybe stop your heart, but ideally after you'd married into the peerage. Arsenic wafers were sold over the counter and advertised with surreal chirpiness for bright eyes and white skin, because nothing says healthy like a softly glowing complexion and a slight internal organ failure. And yet, did they all perish from these flamboyant rituals? Not quite. The Victorian constitution was strangely resilient, or perhaps the sheer force of fashion provided some sort of protective glamour. Either way, a great many made it through while looking unnaturally vibrant, if occasionally confused about whether it was the rouge or the room spinning. Now rest your imaginative eyes and let that mental image of beetle-cheeked debutantes and arsenic-kissed waifs softly fade. For in the hushed drawing room of history, we have still more secrets to whisper. And one, in particular, has everything to do with the lengths a Victorian would go to reshape her very bones. Let us wander now, quietly, slowly, into the perfume mist of Victorian boudoir, where beauty rituals became more than fashion. They became endurance challenges. Tonight's strange secret, the fine art of arsenic face pills and belladonna eye drops, which, shockingly, were not part of a murder mystery, but rather a beauty regimen so committed, it made modern contouring look tame. Let's begin with arsenic. Ah yes, arsenic, the quiet little poison that had been, for centuries, both a deadly villain and awkwardly a trusted best friend in the beauty aisle of the 19th century. Touted in tabloids and whispered about in parlours, arsenic wafers were sold as miracle makers, promising a porcelain complexion so pale no sunlight dared disturb it. Ladies were advised, with Victorian gentility, to ingest teeny tiny amounts, just a smidge. On the regular, you know, for that desirable, I've never lifted a finger or gone outdoors look. Pale skin was the signifier of wealth and delicacy, because tans were for people who, heaven forbid, worked. Arsenic caused capillaries to constrict, making the skin appear smoother, less blotchy, and supremely corpse-like, if taken too enthusiastically. There were, of course, consequences. A miscalculated nibble of an arsenic pill might lead to symptoms that one couldn't quite rouge over, like hair loss, vomiting, or gently dying. But wasn't a luminous, ghostly glow worth the gamble? Now, arsenic's alluring cousin, belladonna, named from the Italian for beautiful woman, was another charmer. Derived from the deadly nightshade plant, because trust, nothing says beauty like a hallucinogenic weed, belladonna was once dripped directly into the eyes to dilate a lady's pupils, Why? To simulate that dreamy, wide-eyed look of innocent distress. A trend inspired by the Renaissance but revived by Victorians who thought, quite romantically, that it gave the impression of constant fascination, or possibly mild concussion. The dilated pupils made eyes look larger, glassier, and vaguely unreal, like a child forever mid-whimsy, or someone who'd just been startled by an idea about poetry. Society swooned. Science, on the other hand, winced. The practice could cause blurred vision, eye pain, and in enthusiastic doses, permanent blindness. Quite a price for fluttery lashes and that damsel seeing stars aesthetic. As if that weren't enough, beauty arsenals expanded to include powders and creams equally tainted with lead and mercury. One truly stunning concoction was known as Venetian ceruse, a lead-based face paint that dated back to earlier centuries, but never quite fell out of favor. It promised perfect paleness and opacity, almost as if you were carved from alabaster by an unemployed angel. Unfortunately, it also absorbed through the skin, slowly poisoning the user and, in a tragic twist, increasing facial blemishes. This, in turn, required more ceruse. Rinse and repeat, sometimes literally. For extra sparkle, some inventors suggested combining beauty treatment with the power of electricity. Beauty galvanic masks appeared, essentially wearable circuits wrapped across the face, promising to stimulate circulation with gentle electric pulses. Newspapers rather cheerfully referred to them as electrosurgical novelties for the complexion. On went the copper plates and wires, operated by trembling batteries. Beauty, it seems, was not only pain, it was shockingly inefficient. And then, whispering through the wallpapered halls of Victorian homes, came rumours of radium. When the new century neared and glowing substances were unearthed, the public was first enchanted, then irradiated. Face creams and bath salts with radium promised to rejuvenate the skin from the inside out, because nothing says fresh like a faint internal scorch. Let's not forget the more delicate bits. Eyelashes, for example, were often enhanced by sewing in fine threads, or more bravely, lashes from young animals. There were also lash and brow beautifiers, dark pomades, sometimes made from coal dust and Vaseline, intended to coax brows into architectural triumph. One could gently paste them on with a toothbrush, then sit still, very still, until gravity made its opinion known. By now, perhaps you can picture them. The Victorian ladies, perched in satin-covered chairs near flickering lamps, eyes wide from belladonna, skin softly shimmering with arsenic serenity, eyelashes frozen in delicate terror. They weren't just looking beautiful. They were participating in an Olympic event of hazardous elegance. And don't worry, all of this they did with grace, poise, and enough perfume to empty a lavender field. As they crept into bed beside their powder-smeared vanities, they whispered to themselves, "Beauty is worth discomfort, possibly even moderate peril." Let's tiptoe away now, leaving behind the lace and danger. Lie back, and in our next sleepy breath, we'll peek into beauty's quieter, quirkier finale. You deserve a rest, ideally one that doesn't involve uranium bath salts. Let us drift now to the final curl of the Victorian eyelash, the end of the powder-puffed promenade through the era's quirkiest beauty secrets, where even the oddest rituals wore a corset of decorum and a bonnet of baffling charm. By the late 19th century, the Victorian beauty ideal had become an intricate dance of discipline, deception, and a fair bit of lead-based guesswork. Appearances weren't just deceiving, they were thoroughly lacquered in deception, with a dash of lavender oil for grace. Let's recline now in the satin cushions of 1899, when electric light was bleeding into the drawing rooms and Queen Victoria herself was in her final year, reluctant to abdicate from more than just the throne. And yet, even as the century began to turn its lacy collar away from the gaslit world, beauty held onto its older tricks like an aunt clutching the family silver. Consider the practice of lighting. It sounds musical, doesn't it? A practice only slightly less horrifying than it sounds. A fine ladies' salon in London might offer this curious treatment: the insertion of a thin, hollow candle into the ear canal, then lighting the exposed end, supposedly to draw out toxins and excess wax. Science, dearly dozing with a sherry glass at this point in history, had not yet arrived to spoil the party with facts such as flames near ears are bad, or that's simply not how anatomy works. The resulting experience must have felt like some divine revelation, a crackling whisper inside one's head, promising clearer hearing, luminous thoughts, and, if the marketing was to be believed, a more graceful neck. Why the neck? Because this was Victorian England. Everything was tied to elegance, even anatomy. And then there were the notorious arsenic wafers. These tiny pills were sold in charming tins, with illustrations of improbably pale women looking mysteriously invigorated. The wafers promised to enhance one's complexion by purifying the blood and rendering the user lily-white, glass doll perfect. Side effects included glowing skin and eventual death, but only after an extended courtship with gastric distress. It was poison with a purpose, and people bought it in bulk. It would be unfair, of course, to laugh too hard. After all, isn't modern beauty full of its own mild torment? We just say chemical peel, with such breezy detachment. And yet, it was in the late Victorian twilight that beauty began to shift, ever so slightly, towards something more merciful. There emerged advice columns penned by forward-thinking women who cautioned against mercury creams or suggested replacing your daily 8 lead-white face powder touch-ups with a brisk country walk. Shocking stuff. Some bright souls even began to advocate for smiling, not the stern, portrait-ready grimace, but actual, unfiltered joy, as if beauty could bloom from within. Of course, such scandalous ideas were met with resistance. A smiling young woman might be mistaken for an Irish barmaid, or worse, a suffragist. But the winds were changing, and the corsets, though still rib-crackingly present, were starting to loosen their grip. One of the final fads? Face tapping. Believed to improve circulation and encourage a natural rosiness, it involved gently patting the cheeks and jawline with one's fingertips in delicate, rhythmic patterns. Imagine a group of very ladylike women tapping themselves into a gentle frenzy before the mirror each evening. Oddly meditative, and compared to arsenic, positively healthful. By the final breaths of the century, there were even whispers of soap made for women that didn't strip the skin. Milk baths, oatmeal soaks, and edible lip tints edged their way into polite society. The Victorian woman, ever adaptable, began to choose slightly more humane methods of radiance, while still holding fast to the sacred tenet that beauty must never appear as though it had tried it all. And so, the powder drifted gently down on the decade, a snowfall of elaborate intention, bizarre inventions, and ferocious grace. Because in the end, the Victorians didn't strive for beauty as we know it. They fought for elegance. Theirs was a battleground of doilies, lace, crushed beetles, and crushed ribs, marched upon in heeled boots and whispered perfume. Now, as the gaslights dim and the velvet curtains draw closed on this curious age, May your dreams be like a lavender-scented salon in Mayfair, just without the arsenic. Sleep now, beautifully, historically, and safely.